Hello and welcome. I'm Catalina Marchant de Abreu, and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. Trump tells the world leaders at Davos he wants to buy Greenland and insists he won't use force to get it. U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff says he'll meet with Putin tomorrow, as reports suggest plans to sign a multi-billion-pound prosperity package for a post-war Ukraine have been postponed. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accepts an invitation to join President Trump's Board of Peace. U.S. President Donald Trump is pushing for immediate negotiations to acquire Greenland, saying that the territory is crucial for U.S. national security and military strategy. Speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, he insisted he won't use force, though he warned the U.S. would be unstoppable if needed. Trump's plan has sparked pushback from Denmark, Europe, and NATO allies. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I have tremendous respect for both the people of Greenland and the people of Denmark, tremendous respect. But every NATO ally has an obligation to be able to defend their own territory. And the fact is, no nation or group of nations is in any position to be able to secure Greenland other than the United States. We're a great power, much greater than people even understand. We need it for strategic national security and international security. This enormous unsecured island is actually part of North America, on the northern frontier of the Western Hemisphere. That's our territory. It is therefore a core national security interest of the United States of America. And in fact, it's been our policy for hundreds of years to prevent outside threats from entering our hemisphere, and we've done it very successfully. We've never been stronger than we are now.
For more on this, I'm joined by Tim Townsend, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy. Jim, thank you for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jim. Today, sign of de-escalation over Greenland?
No, I think Trump is very focused and very intent on getting Greenland one way or another. And, you know, his ego is now part of it, too, because he's come out so publicly and is so unyielding when it comes to what he wants, which is possessing Greenland. So if anything, you know, he is even more intent. And there could come a time if he gets really frustrated with negotiations and then somehow he can't come up with a way to acquire Greenland, that he might turn to a military force. He could change his mind. So I think this story is going to be with us for a while.
And Jim, Donald Trump also made some remarks concerning NATO, arguing that U.S. control of Greenland would strengthen the NATO alliance. His exact words, I believe, were this would not be a threat to NATO. This would greatly enhance the security of the entire alliance. Of course, we know that NATO and European leaders argue that the exact opposite. So they say this would fracture the alliance, stripping away the politics here. Jim, is there any logic that we might see to Trump's argument from a NATO security perspective?
Well, I think we have to separate out a couple things. First, this kind of rhetoric and this type of debate between one NATO ally, the United States, and the other allies, Denmark, the others, that hurts NATO because it undercuts the confidence that we have in each other. It undercuts the commitment, particularly from the leader of the alliance. So that is what really harms NATO. That undercuts NATO. The Greenland is a vital part of the defense of North America. It's a vital part of Europe as well. It is important geographically. So certainly the alliance wants to make sure it's secure, But that security doesn't have to come from the Greenland being occupied by the United States or bought by the United States. NATO has done a very good job over the past number of years during the Cold War and afterwards, making sure that there wasn't a threat to Greenland, that was deterred. This has not been an object of fighting between the U.S. and Russia or NATO and Russia over Greenland. It's been in fine shape. And so NATO continues to do a good job. It doesn't require the U.S. buying Greenland.
And during these Davos remarks, Jim, President Trump also said that he believes that the U.S. has been treated very unfairly by NATO. He's been saying this repeatedly. He insists that America will always be there for NATO, for the alliance. So he's repeatedly been questioning whether that commitment is actually fully reciprocated. From your own experience, where does this sense of unfair treatment come from?
Well, I think it comes from a misunderstanding that he has. I will tell you from my experience, NATO has invoked Article 5 only one time in its history, and that was to protect the United States after 9/11. So the U.S. has been a beneficiary of NATO and NATO's defense. So they've been tried and tested, and the commitment was there, and it will always be there. I think this idea that we've been treated unfairly by the alliance, by alliance members, it comes from his feeling that allies haven't put enough money into their own defense. And I think that is changing quite a bit. But I think his dismissal of NATO is ill-founded.
So President Trump also said that he's agreed to meet with NATO's Secretary General, Mark Rutte, and other European allies at Davos to discuss the future of Greenland at this week's World Economic Forum, the future of Greenland, of course, and the future of this alliance. So what do you expect to come out of these talks for the future of this transatlantic alliance that is in question right now?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, and we're all wondering that as well. I think, number one, I'm glad that he's meeting with European members who are there, and I'm glad he's meeting with Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General. I'm glad they're talking. I'm not sure they're going to say anything different. I don't see the president saying anything that he hasn't already said, particularly in his speech. And Mark Rutte and the other Europeans that he might meet with, they're going to stand behind Denmark and Greenland and say that you can't buy them. And so there's going to have to be another approach. And it could be, frankly speaking personally, that maybe NATO comes in and says, look, we will put some NATO installations on Greenland. We will put a NATO force on Greenland if that will make you feel more secure in terms of keeping Greenland safe. So maybe NATO comes into the middle and says, we'll play a bigger role there. I mean, it could be something like that, but we'll have to see what these talks produce. Probably not too much, given it's early days in terms of negotiations.
Well, and during his speech, more on that, Trump also said that only the U.S. can guarantee Greenland's security, claiming that every NATO ally has an obligation to be able to defend their own territory. So in practical words, he is framing it this way. Trump is saying that Greenland belongs to North America. How can NATO allies respond to this?
Well, and the president says a lot of things that don't necessarily fit reality. So that's one thing. The second thing is, while it's true that as a priority, NATO nations need to have the ability to protect themselves to begin with. But it's also understood that if they come under attack, that the other allies will come to their aid. And it's the same thing with Greenland. It's not Denmark's job solely to defend Greenland from attack. If Greenland is attacked, not just Denmark, but everybody else within the alliance will come to the assistance of Denmark to help deal with whatever this attack may be. So the idea that it's Denmark alone and therefore Denmark is not able to do the right thing, it's the wrong perspective. It's NATO at the end of the day that will provide protection to Greenland. It's not Denmark alone.
Well, Jim Townsend, thank you for joining us, and thank you so much for your perspective today. Let's continue this conversation with international relations senior expert Malek Setiz. Malek, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So President Donald Trump told the World Economic Forum that Europe is not going in the right direction. So what exactly does he mean by this, and what implications could this have eventually for the future of U.S.-European relations that are in question right now?
Thank you. It depends on what do we mean by right direction. European Union is the most coordinated organization in all over the world, and the values and the principles that the European Union have is very much clear for the international community. So this unity shows that the European Union will act together in order to safeguard the security and prosperity in the European Union. So I think President Trump's rhetoric about the right direction, it will damage the relationship between such a well-established organization and coordinated organization with the United States in such a way of talking about.
And we've seen European allies, they're pushing back on Greenland. For example, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that he won't yield to US pressure. French President Emmanuel Macron has floated the idea of a UE retaliation. He's cited the trade bazooka. So how risky is it for European leaders to actually escalate against the United States? For example, who stands to gain or to lose here, militarily or economically?
The escalation of the situation is against the interest of both parties. I understand that the United States is a great partner for European unions, and Europeans are very much dependent on United States. But the Americans should also understand that European Union is a great partner, is a big potential for United States economy. So such a relationship which damages the coordinated diplomatic strategic partnership between European Union and the United States will damage both sides. Economically, politically, socially, culturally will badly damage. So there is no winner of such a situation. So according to my analysis, both parties will badly suffer for any kind of escalation of the situation.
Yes, and on that perspective, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent actually urged European leaders at Davos to, he says, avoid reflexive anger, quote, over Greenland. He also said to sit down with President Donald Trump and hear him out. So the big question here is, do Trump's ambitions over Greenland have any national and international legitimacy here?
My short question is no, because according to the national interest of Greenland, the majority of people, only 6% of Greenland population are interested in U.S. intervention. But it means that the majority of people are against it. The Greenland parliament, the government, the people are against any intervention of the United States in such a way. So it has not a legitimate, power. According to the international law, Denmark and the United States have a partnership, an agreement, a strategic agreement from 1951. Based on this agreement, the United States has a military base in Greenland, and they have unlimited freedom of extension of the base and making any kind of operation in this area. So any reaction against this process would be also against the international law. So it has not international and national legitimacy.
Well, and even though European allies are pushing back, we do see President Trump doubling down on his Greenland threat, saying there's no going back now. So is there any way out of this geopolitical challenge over Greenland? what diplomatic solutions might actually prevent a full blown out crisis, or is it too late? Has Trump gone too far?
This is a very good question. No, it's not late. I think President Trump should trust the professional diplomacy. I think both parties, the United States and the Europeans, should organize a professional diplomatic working groups to work on the issue, to maintain the interest of both sides, both Americans and Europeans. Strategically, both parties, Americans and Europeans, they have a common interest in the region, geopolitically and also geostrategically. So I think there is a path for diplomatic solution. I think the Danish government have suggested to organize a working group, and based on this working group, the recommendations of this working group will make a proper solution for a diplomatic solution between two parties.
Speaking of parties, Malek, if tensions between the U.S. and Europe continue to escalate, what role might other actors play here? Could Russia or even China intervene, especially as China, we've seen right now, positioning itself as a more reliable partner than the U.S. in Davos?
You know, it's not a good idea to involve Russians or Chinese in this process, because it may make the situation more sensitive, especially from the United States point of perspective. So I think the best way to make a proper solution, this is the European and American diplomacy and professional tackling by researchers who can provide proper recommendations for both parties to tackle the question. If a third party, especially Russia and China, will interfere or make any kind of mediation, it will damage the situation, especially from the American perspective.
Malek, Setiz, thank you so much for joining us today.
You are most welcome.
The European backlash against Trump's push to acquire Greenland is now spilling over into Ukraine diplomacy. The Financial Times reports tensions have delayed a planned $800 billion prosperity package for post-war Ukraine that was set to be unveiled at Davos. Officials say disputes over Trump's Board of Peace and Greenland derailed talks, with the U.S. missing a key meeting. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is also scheduled to meet with Putin tomorrow. For more on this, I'm joined by John Kavulich, Senior Editor for Outcome Modeling Analysis at Issue Insight. John, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
John, there's now little expectation that the Ukraine Prosperity Plan will be unveiled at Davos. We've seen this Financial Times report that quotes one official saying, "Nobody is in any mood to stage a grand spectacle around an agreement with Donald Trump right now." So as disputes over Greenland and the proposed Board of Peace overtook Ukraine on the agenda, in practical terms, what does that shift mean for Ukraine right now?
Well, unfortunately, President Zelenskyy has gotten used to being overtaken by events, whether it is Gaza and Israel, whether it's Syria, whether it's China, North Korea, interests relating bilaterally with the U.S. and Russia. So he doesn't like to be pushed aside, but he's used to it. In this particular case, this $800 billion fund was pretty much nonsense from the get-go. It was simply created as a means to entice President Trump, who always likes the biggest, the best, the finest, number one, et cetera, et cetera. So it really wasn't based on any realistic perspectives. It was just performative. It was optics. In terms of the greater issue, which was a discussion that was designed to be had within Davos about security guarantees, about the future role with respect to the United States and NATO as it relates to Ukraine, that was more important, but still there was not going to be anything substantive coming out of Davos. So President Zelenskyy, said for the last several days that he was going to be remaining in Ukraine because of the attacks by Russia, which have been substantial, systemic, systematic, and devastating. And that was the right call. Now, President Trump, in his speech, sort of blurts out that he's going to be meeting with President Zelenskyy, and now President Zelenskyy is coming. I think is a mistake for President Zelenskyy to go. He should stay in Ukraine because he's going to come away disappointed because, as you pointed out, the focus is on Greenland, the focus is on Donald Trump, and there really isn't room right now for a discussion about Ukraine.
So you touched on that point. There were competing reports over the presence of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy at Davos, because some reports say that he will not attend the event without anything concrete to sign here. So does going or not going, does this risk making Ukraine actually look sidelined at a moment when visibility matters for a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia?
Well, they are sidelined. That's in the ethos. That's not debatable. The challenge for President Zelenskyy, and it's sort of which is least bad as opposed to which is good. And that is President Trump now name dropped him in this speech with, "I'm meeting with him." So now President Zelenskyy is in the position of, if he doesn't go, he potentially slights President Trump. And President Trump, as we know, is incredibly fragile when it comes to how he interprets being embarrassed. And so for a head of state to not come when Donald Trump has said he's been summoned, that risks even worse results for President Zelenskyy. So he's in just an awful choice, he's got an awful choice to make, which is show up knowing that he's not going to get what he wants after he said he's only going to show up if he gets what he wants, and knowing that President Trump is really just interested in the performative because he's more focused on Greenland.
And from Moscow's perspective, what's the takeaway here from this Davos moment? Do they actually see something here as a Western distraction, Western division, or Western fatigue? Does this actually strengthen their position here?
All of it: distraction, division, fatigue. If you're in the Kremlin, you're hopping around, you're happy. If you're in Beijing, you're hopping around, you're happy. If you're in Iran, you're hopping around, you're happy. And even President Maduro sitting in the detention center in New York's probably happy too. But the reality is that there simply isn't. There isn't as much depth here as I think people want to believe there is. President Trump made some, interesting and often telling statements. I mean, when we listen to him giving one of these speeches, it very much is just his brain's opened up and we see how it functions. And he said some things that, for the Russians aren't necessarily all great. For example, he talked about, with Greenland, with NATO, I don't like to defend things I don't own. Well, NATO is defending what you don't own. By definition, there are 32 members and they are supposed to defend each other, even though they don't own one another. They're not shareholders in each other. And then secondly, and this goes a little far back to his first term, his company had a lease. They did not own, but they leased, ironically, from the federal government, a property in Washington, D.C., near the White House, old post office building. They turned it into the Trump International Hotel. And eventually the hotel didn't do well and they sold the lease, even though they made money on it. But he invested in a building that he didn't own. He invested in a business to grow it and make it better. That at the end, he didn't own the structure. So Greenland, there is in his history an example and multiple examples of where his company has leased, not necessarily owned, property, and they will improve it and they will find ways to maximize its value. So I think eventually we'll see, a solution to Greenland that may not be far away from how he operated his businesses.
Exactly. He's pushing on his business plans into his political ones, using most of his strategies there. But also the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is set to travel to Moscow on Thursday for talks with President Putin. This meeting is reportedly taking place at Russia's request, which is actually unusual at this stage. So what does this tell us about the current state of the peace process? And realistically, what should we expect out of these talks?
Well, the invitation isn't unusual because there have been meetings between Mr. Kushner, Mr. Witkoff, Mr. Kushner, Mr. Dmitriev, and others. So it makes sense that you're going to extend an invitation because everyone's at Davos. It's a short flight, Switzerland to Moscow. Mr. Witkoff has his plane. He's there. He's been meeting with Dmitriev, as Mr. Kushner. And so it isn't, I don't think anyone should read an awful lot into it. For President Zelenskyy, it's always uncomfortable when he knows that he's meeting with President Trump, he's meeting with Mr. Witkoff, he's meeting with Mr. Kushner, and then two of them are off to Moscow. And then he likely knows that President Trump's going to be speaking to President Putin after the discussion. So he always feels, whatever he says could, in essence, disadvantage him. But the Russians, people just seem to forget this 20-point plan that President Zelenskyy continues to talk is 90% complete. How can it be 90% complete if three issues remain: territory, security guarantees, and compensation for Ukraine? Now, without the real estate, without Russia controlling 20% of Ukraine, all the rest of this doesn't matter, because it's only by controlling the real estate that President Putin is attempting to meet his goals and his objectives. And the Ukrainians have held him to that. But that's the most important question that has to be answered by the Ukrainians. So when he says he's got 90% completed, it really isn't. And the Russians right now, they get a vote. And people often forget that when presented with a 20-point document, President Putin gets a vote on that. And I'll sum up in this regard that one of the items in the 20-point plan is about Ukraine becoming a member of the European Union. And part of it is within 2 years or 3 years, an expedited process, et cetera. That has no reason to be in this document, because even though Russia does care about Ukraine and the European Union, because it matters more, they're not going to block it. But by putting something into this document and presenting it to the Russians, you're now giving the Russians an ability to negotiate it. So problem with this 20 points is that you could really get down to maybe 5 that really matter. The rest, all it does is create more opportunity for the Russians to say, okay, you want European Union membership, but maybe we now want this. And now here we go with the ping pong ball of diplomacy.
John Kavulich, thank you for joining us today and for your perspective on this.
Thank you.
The assassin of former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has been sentenced to life in prison. Tetsuya Yamagami shot Mr. Abe in the back during an open-air campaign rally in Nara Prefecture in 2022. Chris Gilbert reports.
Tetsuya Yamagami arrived at NATO court in a white van to learn his fate on Wednesday. 3.5 years after killing Japan's longest-serving prime minister, he will now serve the rest of his life in prison. Yamagami planned his killing of Abe well in advance and took the opportunity of the 2022 upper house election campaign to execute it. Using a gun made entirely out of legally sourced materials and built at home, he shot Abe from behind. The killing sparked a review of police security and of gun ownership laws. Yamagami's trial began in October, with a guilty verdict all but locked in after he admitted the crime. He said he was pushed to kill Abe over his alleged connections to the controversial Unification Church. He was aggrieved after his mother donated his entire family savings to the group. The outcome is a win for prosecutors who are aiming for a life sentence. They called the crime an extremely grave incident that is unprecedented in Japan's post-war history. The case has gripped the country, and the public gathered outside the courthouse to hear the verdict.
I think it's lenient. The prosecution's request was soft. Yamagami killed Japan's longest-serving prime minister. I think he should have gotten the death penalty.
Abe resigned as prime minister for health reasons in 2020, but remained a powerful figure in Japanese politics. His death left a power vacuum in the ruling party, the LDP, which was sent into a tailspin with years of poor approval ratings and a rotating door of leaders since. Its popularity has improved since Sanae Takaichi became leader in October. She openly models her economic policy and hawkish security agenda on Shinzo Abe. Experts say the sentencing closes the book on a dark period of Japanese history, ahead of the nation again going to the polls for a national election in February. Chris Gilbert, Al Arabiya English.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. Spain has suffered a second deadly train crash in just 2 days. A train driver was killed and at least 37 people were injured when a train derailed near Barcelona. Spain's rail operator says the crash occurred after a wall collapsed into the tracks following heavy rain across the region this week. U.S. aviation safety campaigners say the Air India plane that crashed in Ahmedabad last year had a history of technical problems, including a reported in-flight fire. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner, which was en route to London, went down shortly after takeoff, killing 260 people. The group says that while the official investigation is still ongoing, it has now submitted its findings to the U.S. Senate. The coffin of the late Italian fashion designer Valentino arrived today at the headquarters of his foundation in Rome. The remains of the 93-year-old will lie in state until Thursday, and his funeral will take place in Rome on Friday. Among those securing to pay their last respects to Valentino were 2 longtime business partners and his family. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has accepted an invitation to join U.S. President Donald Trump's Board of Peace. In a statement, his office said Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that he has accepted U.S. President Donald Trump's invitation and will join as a member of the Board of Peace, which will be composed of leaders of the world. The board was conceived to oversee the rebuilding of a post-war Gaza. There are reports that members have to pay $1 billion for a permanent spot on it. For more on this, I'm joined from London by international negotiator Nomi Bar-Yaacov. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Catalina, for having me on your show.
Nomi, we've just received this from our sources in Davos. U.S. President Donald Trump has extended an invitation for a signing of his Gaza Board of Peace. So you've heard from sources there could be a signing of the Board of Peace charter on Thursday. Tell us more of what you know about this, Nomi.
Well, he sent, US President Donald Trump sent more than 60 invitations for heads of states or heads of government to join his board of peace for signing that should have taken place this morning. So clearly, I think partly maybe the delay of the plane, but partly he didn't get the response that he had hoped to get or assumed that he would get, because out of 60 plus countries that, or heads of states that were invited, not that many replied positively. I mean, in the last sort of just very recently, Saudi Arabia and other states in the Gulf have issued a joint statement that they will join the board in order to help promote peace in Palestine. But there are many more skeptical states that have mentioned that they won't join. I mean, yesterday, President of France, Emmanuel Macron, stated very clearly that he has no intention of joining. Likewise, Norway. So in Western Europe, there is much skepticism, UK as well, much skepticism about whether to join. I mean, big Muslim countries like Indonesia and Pakistan have accepted the invitation. Clearly, neighboring states, Egypt, Jordan, joined the Saudi-Qatari joint letter. I think there's a show of force there, of unity, that they will do so as long as this is all. I mean, I don't think there is conditionality in the signing or in the joining, but I think the intention is to really work for peace in Palestine. But this Board of Peace, the Charter of the Board of Peace, which I have in my hand, has no mention of Palestine or Gaza in it, and it's clearly, I mean, it's drafted a bit like a sort of a charter of a serious sort of corporate company, not really like a charter of an international body, but there's a clear intention to replace the international existing multinational institutions, namely the UN. So we have to take this sort of very, very, very cautiously and look at the structure not only of the Board of Peace. May I just correct you? It's not $1 billion in order to join. It's $1 billion if states are heads of states are nominated for a period of 3 years and are encouraged by the Charter to donate $1 billion to the organization in the first year. And if they do so in the first year, then they can stay on. And if they don't, then the chairman of the board, who is US President Donald Trump, who has a huge amount of power under this charter, can basically not renew their place in the board. That's basically what it says. It's not that they have to pay $1 billion to get in, it's that they have to pay $1 billion in the first year in order to stay.
That's a great clarification, Nomi, because we still are a bit confused on how this is going to work. But as we mentioned, and notably, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has now accepted this invitation to join the board after he actually was initially hesitating. The Gaza Executive Board will also include representatives from Turkey and Qatar, whose inclusion Netanyahu has opposed. And there's also, and as you mentioned, just recently Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Indonesia, and Pakistan who have joined the board. So how could these tensions, notably between Turkey, Qatar, and Israel, affect the board's ability to actually mediate peace effectively?
Well, we don't really know how it's going to work. I mean, the board itself is a board of representative of states. It's really the executive committee under it that's going to be doing the work, the implementation. The board is more of a representational body. The people appointed to do the real work include a high representative for Gaza, and that's his title. That is His Excellency Nikolai Mladenov. He's a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bulgaria. He's a former special envoy to the Middle East for the United Nations. His exact title was he was the special coordinator for the Middle East peace process based in Jerusalem, and he knows the area very well. Tony Blair wanted the job but didn't get it. There was much opposition for his appointment, but he still is on the executive committee. So the executive committee and, of course, the Palestinian transitional government are going to do the job under the offices of the High Representative, and they report to the Board of Peace. But I mean, you can't really see the heads of states engaging in the nitty-gritty bits on the ground. They're really, as I said, they're more of a representational board, but it is is a very tricky situation, because they have given themselves, or the chairman of the board, Trump, has given himself a terrific amount of power, which is why there is so much opposition to it. And I think it's sort of obligatory for anyone interested to read the charter, because it's always like the devil is in the detail. It's vague enough so that he can really do what he wants. But the job itself of like a transition to second phase in Gaza, and the transformation, hopefully, of Gaza and the West Bank into a Palestinian state, and reaching stability and peace. I mean, that is the aim of the countries that you've just mentioned that have joined. Then I think they really, it's a question of how this is going to be implemented on the ground. He's also pointed to special advisors, Ariel Lightstone, who's been in Israel for a while now, liaising on these issues. So there is quite a cumbersome structure here. And I haven't actually mentioned the International Stabilization Force. That's the force that is, I think, due not before May now. There have been delays. It was supposed to be on the ground a long time ago, but that is the force that no country is really willing to send troops, depending on what, or let's put it this way, Indonesia was going to send 20,000 troops and then kind of minimize the number to maybe 1,000, depending on what the mandate is going to be. No country is going to want to be caught in the crossfire between Israel and Hamas.
Nomi Bar-Yaacov, thank you for joining us today. A reminder of our top stories. Trump tells world leaders at Davos he wants to buy Greenland and insists he won't use force to get it. U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff says he'll meet with Putin tomorrow, as reports suggest plans to sign a multi-billion-pound prosperity package for a post-war Ukraine have been postponed. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accepts an invitation to join President Trump's Board of Peace. And that's all from us on W News Today. We'll be back in a couple of hours with W News Extra.